Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming, first of all. It's very nice to see so many people here. Again, thank you to the museum, Kevin, and particularly Abigail for having my show, and to all of the staff at Gallery Pangolin, Sally, Kath, Claude, and thank you to Jane for making some sense of the essay that I wrote. It wouldn't have been readable without her, I'm sure. Okay, March of Mutability. Let's talk about that first. Is it a meaningful bit of text, or is it just a trite alliteration? Well, it does trip off the tongue rather well, but it does mean something very pertinent to me, and I in fact have borrowed it from a biologist who was really trying to explain what evolution was. That is, evolution is the force that changes every living thing to become eventually different than it previously was. Not in a generation, obviously, but over an enormous amount of time. The other part of the meaning for me is probably the evolution of my own work. So we have the exhibition downstairs, and hopefully most of you have seen that, and there is a text to go with that, well, in fact, two texts in the catalogue. But I think to give it context, really, I need to talk about my previous work and the evolution of that. The main thing you need to know about me, I think, nothing too intimate, but I've had two major preoccupations all of my life, really, and that is nature and art. And as a child, there was one conundrum, really, for me. Was I going to become Henry Moore, or was I going to become Peter Scott? Well, unfortunately, neither have happened, but I did, in my early 20s, make a leap towards art by going to art college, but that was not before I'd experienced life as a zookeeper and given up studying for a science degree. So, the origins of art and the origins of nature. This is what specifically I've come to find as a subject matter, the duality of the two. So, if you like, the art of nature and the nature of art. And for me, they're inextricably linked, and they mean evolution of both. So I think I have to think about, why did art evolve anyway? It's probably too big a subject to take on this evening, but it's just to say that we as humans have our primary sense in our eyes. More than any other mammal, we can see three different phases of light from our eye, where most mammals can only see two. So that's one thing, and I think it probably evolved to celebrate our identities. I'm sure the beginning of art was decorating our bodies, but mainly what I want to talk about is that it developed in tandem with our great narratives of life, the stories that we explain who we are and where we came from, particularly where we came from, I think. So, what is making that funny noise? I don't know. It doesn't matter, I suppose. Well, I think right from the start, to explain these stories, we've always used nature and the images of nature. Right from the great caves of Lascaux and Altamira, people have made pictures of animals, and I'm sure those animals were not simply pictures of what they were looking at outside the cave entrance. They were in fact symbolic of many things, who's to know. But besides us having this aesthetic sense, Nature has an enormous aesthetic sense as well, especially birds. Darwin said that birds were the most aesthetic of all creatures. So, there we are, the aesthetic sense of birds. Well, how do they develop to become such extraordinary, colourful and varied species? Well, bluntly speaking, sex. Without sex, you don't get diversity, at least very little diversity. Mutations occur with DNA being malfunctioning, but sex or sexual reproduction, which started something like 1.2 billion years ago, has speeded up the shapes and the forms that we call biodiversity. Now, manakins, which are these little birds from South America, they've developed a fantastically beautiful plumage, and they're one of the species that uses what's called a lek. A lek is where males strut their stuff to impress the female to mate. And you can see she's very dull in comparison. But of course, she doesn't need to entice anybody, and she needs to survive in the nest. Now, these chaps not only have got this fantastic colourful plumage, which I think is the aesthetic quality that the female likes, but she likes much more. These aren't single males competing against each other. This is a snapshot of a dance. These creatures are dancing from one end to the other. And the subordinate males don't get to mate. It's only the females, it's only the main male that gets to mate and pass on his genes. So what happens if you don't have a gaudy plumage? What if you're a little brown job? What do you do then to entice the females? Well, you make art. This is bowerbirds. There's about 20 species of bowerbirds, and they all make different bowers. It's not a nest, it's a boudoir. It's to entice the female to come and see my etchings, I suppose, would be the easiest equivalent. So that's what they do. They impress the female. I mean, this is the only species, really, that makes art in a way we would call it. And that's to say, each individual has a different palette of colour, and he has to impress the female, and if she doesn't like it, tough. So let's have a look at my work. It may be that humans made art in the first place for exactly the same reason. But I feel that it's more likely got going, at least, when the big stories about where we come from and who we are. I made this piece, probably one of my first bronze pieces. It's called In the Beginning, which I thought was quite a good place to start. But there were quite a few years before this happened, but this is when I decided I needed to find a personal mythology or even a collective mythology and where to look. Well, I looked in the great stories about world art and world religion and world mythology. And this one was about, well, it comes down to sex again, really, because however God put us on this earth, he's still got to have a male or a female. And one of the stories was there was a creature having both sexes at the same time. Now, I thought this was going to be problematic. So I've made them going in opposite directions, which some of us might think is particularly pertinent. But after God split them in two, they simply turned round and got back together again. There you are, sex again. So I knew what I really wanted to do was to bring together humanity and the natural world. What were the stories that brought these two things together? Well, in my own growing up, I suppose the Christian Bible was the only thing that had myths that we all learnt. And we all know about Noah and the ark will come up again, as you know. But what does the raven simplify? What is the symbol of the raven? Well, for some reason, the raven gets a very bad press. Maybe because he's black, maybe because he ends up after the battle on the battlefield. But anyway, if you notice, in the story, the raven was set off first after the ark started to, well, at least when the water started to recede, the raven was sent off to see what was happening. Actually, he didn't come back, did he? He had to send out the dove, which we all know brought back the olive branch to show that the waters were receding. But if you notice in my piece, however hard that Noah looks for God, his sight is masked by the raven's talons. He can't see God because perhaps God wasn't there. So, man and fish. What is the nature of the fish? Well, when my mother died, I offered to make her church, which she was a big part of, a tree of life. Horrified was the reaction. They did not want a tree of life. The tree of life was somehow anti the church. I'm not quite sure how, but I blame Henry VIII. Imagine growing up in a society where our churches were full of sculptures, animals, Romanesque images. I think we would have a completely different idea of what sculpture and art could be. But nonetheless, I did take on the notion. He said he would be happy to have a fish. I thought, fish? Why a fish? And of course, the Christian mythology does have the fish, but mostly because of the way it's spelt and a secret significance for being a Christian. But for me, I thought the fish was a symbol of life. It was something that we needed to look after. The fish was life itself. And in this piece called Embracing the Sea, I made a sculpture for Deal in Kent. And when you make a public sculpture, of course, you do have to suggest that you're making it for the place that it's going to rest, which I did because there were still fishermen going off the sandbanks in small boats. But particularly, I wanted to be the idea of embracing the sea, embracing the environment. So these were the stories that I was beginning to feel I wanted to make in art. And then there was a sea change, I think. And I think it was because of this. Probably true for all artists, but certainly true for me. Subject and object. Subject on this hand, object on the other hand. What do I mean? Well, the subject is the narrative. The subject is the story. The object is the thing itself. What's it made of? How is it made? And it has to have a right for itself. A thing in itself, if you like. So I've called this go-between, and you can see it starts to become much simpler. The bird is an archetypal bird. The face is becoming less naturalistic. And across the surface, I've marked it. I've marked it with indentations as a way of taking it away from reality. I don't want the thing to be a reality. I want it to stand as an object that perhaps can be interpreted in its own right. So I decided that if I was going to make an object that had its own authenticity, it would have to be much simpler. So there's no attempt to make it a real bird, and by making the indentations all across the surface, it becomes very much more of an object. But I think it starts to reach back to our cultural past, where you can see much simpler images. The tendency is for people to think that in Western art we simply have a linear progression from Egypt into Greece, into Rome, into the Renaissance. But we must remember that art was being made all around the world. For 40,000 years, people have been making objects, and we don't have to just involve ourselves in that linear Western art making. So what difference does that mean? Well, I think it means that the objects are more totemic. They come from a different place. This piece is called Moondog, and I'm building up a lexicon of images, I suppose. The bird on one hand and the dog on the other. The bird I tend to think of as being the creative symbol, the symbol of human how shall I put it? I was going to say spiritual, but I don't necessarily mean spiritual, but I think it's the element that gives us our the good part of ourselves, whereas dog somehow is a much more corporal, ambiguous symbol. So in this one, you can see that I've marked it with crescents. Crescents for the moon, crescents for suggesting that the moon, madness, and the great unknown, which is the 20th century unknown, is the unconscious. Images of the unconscious. So, what we have now is a dog with a dog imprinted upon it. Dog on dog, if you like. It's called he dog. And why it's called he dog is that I became aware, or I suppose we're all aware, that there are markers within our body which we pass on. So in the males, a Y chromosome marks the individual, which is carried through to each generation. So this chap has his own individual mark, which he will no doubt pass on. The woman, on the other hand, also has a marker, and it comes in the mitochondrial DNA. So only women pass on that, and we can map our existence through looking at both these features. So there I've imprinted little figures all across the female. I suppose she's standing as the reproduction of ourselves. So what I've done now, if you can imagine going back to ancestor bird, which was the simple bird with dots on, and the last slide of the primal woman, I've melded them together so that the bird and the female become one object. To my surprise, I found that this was a whole unfound tradition. There was an archaeologist called Maria Gimbutas who discovered in the eastern part of Europe, which she called Old Europe, a whole lot of images that were associated with the Great Mother. So instead of God being male and warlike, God was associated with the earth. And I think this was pertinent because, after all, the inherited mythology that we've got comes from the Middle East. Middle East is essentially a desert area, so very few creatures are brought into the stories. Whereas in old Europe, all the animals are brought in, birds especially, bird-headed goddesses, all the animals from hedgehogs to snakes. Some time ago, you'll see. So this one was called the Goodwood Goddess because it was commissioned to go in the sculpture park in Goodwood Sculpture Park. Again, a woman-bird hybrid, the great goddess again, revering nature. And I think her body seems to have stretched to become maybe the whole cosmos. The gilded dots in the centre, especially in certain lights, look like stars, I suppose. So you can see that my sculpture has become simplified and pattern or covered in patterns, indentated to be representative of a story or an idea, or simply to be decorative in terms of making the forms much more coherent. Then I decided that perhaps it was possible, instead of making these abstract indentations, I could use my indentations as drawing itself. This led to the possibility of making the sculptures much, much simpler. So the line stands in for form. You can see that I don't have to make a mouth, a nose or an eye. I can simply draw it in. And then they've become colourful because I want the colour to take it away from reality. Not that there's much chance of this being mistaken for reality. But on the other hand, the lines can be very much more readable by it being a contrasting colour. You're all very quiet. Okay. Wishbone bird. Here you can see I've used line and dots and made a very, very simplified bird. I can remember being quite excited because how do you make a sculpture of a bird that's going to stand on a tiny series of legs or couple of legs? Well, I solved it quite easily by simply drawing the leg in. And I think this was a reference also going back to shamanism and the caves. Lascaux in particular, there's a very important image in Lascaux because normally in the cave painting of Paleolithic Europe, there are only animals. But in this case, there's an image of a man. He has to be a shaman. He's got a bird's head. He's next to a fallen bison that's been cut open, and he has a small staff, which is bird-headed, next to him. Now, I can't say that I used these images of Lascaux specifically to make my sculptures, but what happens often is I make the sculpture and then find the image has a resonance in the work that I'm looking at from the past. Okay, this piece is called Lines of Lineage. I made a whole series of works which I showed under a title called Behind the Lines. Lines being the way that the sculptures were produced, and the thought behind the title was what was behind the lines. But I also felt that I was using it in the way when people are being fired at, they get their head down behind the lines. So this one, if you noticed previously that some of the forms were becoming patterned to take the drawing, this one, it's very much more three-dimensional, goes out into 360 degrees. But it's one of the first ones that starts taking on the notion of evolution. Why evolution? Well, we know from Darwin that he knew how, or believed he knew, how that things evolved, and he called that natural selection. But he didn't know why and what the mechanisms were. But working at the same time, there was a monk called Friar Mendel, and his experiments were with peas of all things. And he proved that heredity was a matter of mixing something within either the body or the plant that would make a new type of plant, a hybrid. So there we have it. I've made indentations, patterns, lines, drawings, and then I made the lines three-dimensional. So now I was thinking that instead of making the lines carved into the surface of the sculpture, I would make them three-dimensional. It seemed much more sculptural, I would say. Symphysis was the title. Symphysis is the coming together of two elements. So again, perhaps there's some sex in there as well, if you'd like care to look for it. Now I must explain that there are many sculptures in between all of these things. So, I mean, I'm not showing you everything I've made, but I'm trying to pick out things that seem to have a relevance in what I'm going to call the evolution of my work. Repository was this one. I got to the idea that a vessel would be a sort of reproductive store of my own images, my own signs and symbols. So the outside indicates what I was thinking imaginatively, what was on the inside. So this is one of the first vessels, which you will have seen some others downstairs. The title of this one is called Mind Menagerie. So what I've done is I've taken simply two of the symbols, I call them glyphs, and they're the opposite. So each symbol is either a bird or a dog. It's put onto the head in that way, and it's called Mind Menagerie because there's a famous anthropologist called Levi Strauss who maintained that animals were good to think with. That is, that's the way that we express ourselves, by looking at the natural world and making images of it. We can't make images of ourselves and understand them as traits. We need to use animals. And we all do it, and we still do it. Right. This is about evolution, surprisingly. It's called Part of the Puzzle. And now I've used the line actually not as a pattern, but in a descriptive way as the pattern that exists in reality. Not absolutely, it's not sort of a real fish. But I couldn't get over this conundrum, which is, why are birds, fish, insects, butterflies so brightly patterned and brightly covered? Females that enjoy their mates to be colourful and beautiful and patterned have something in their minds like a template, and the more the template is available in their mate, the more likely they are to accept that as a mate. So here we have the same thing really, but two males facing each other. Red Queen rules. Well, you've probably, if you've looked at my work, you will have heard about the Red Queen, but I'll mention her here and then I'll mention her again a little later. A chap called Van Valen decided, a scientist again, but he decided really to understand things, just as we use metaphor in art, science has to use the metaphor. The Red Queen, well, she's in Alice in Wonderland. Well, actually, Alice in Through the Looking Glass. And what does she say to Alice? She says, we have to run all we can simply to stay where we are. So, the idea here is that the males have to become more and more beautiful for them to be able to pass on their genes. This one, called Frozen Ark. In 2015, Elizabeth Kolbert wrote a book called The Sixth Extinction. It's a seminal book, and it talks about the predicament that we find ourselves in, the Anthropocene. Now, in that book, she visits various places where DNA is being selected from individuals in the hope that they'll be able to pass that on in the future. I mean, there isn't the ability to do that now, but I wondered what that would look like. So I've put the species on the outside and imagined the DNA being held within. You may have seen this one downstairs. This is a metaphorical ark. I've made it in the shape of a conventional ark, but again, I'm imagining the DNA of all the species that we would need to keep. An impossibility, an absolute impossibility, but it's something that's perhaps is going to have to happen. I've called it high and dry, mainly because even if we saved these animals, where are they going to live? Where's the habitat? Have we got space for them? We've stolen most niches, most habitat spaces. We've changed the environment. We've changed everything that they need to exist in. Perhaps this is the most pertinent because it's being shown at King's Place, next to the canal. And as you can see, it looks as if it is high and dry. But I think there was an irony about this one that was exhibited at Chester Cathedral. Perhaps some of you saw it. I thought there was a huge irony that the ark is always associated back with Noah. And in that case, Noah was the human guardian for saving nature. So what huge irony it seems to me that it's now us humans that are threatening the whole of biodiversity. This one's downstairs. I called it the whole caboodle. Well, mostly because I like that term, but what does it mean? Well, I mean, it means everything. Everything's under threat, isn't it? It has a degree of arcness about it, but it's collapsing, it's deflating. I couldn't help feeling that there was some kind of analogous element to the human migrants that we see in these collapsing inflatable boats as they cross the Mediterranean. How are we doing? Okay. In less than no time. So what I've done is imagined the vessel as a container for our modern narratives. And so the outside flags up what the interior is for, I suppose. So we have an evolution from cell-like forms at the bottom through to animal and natural forms to our own man-made symbols at the top. And in this one called In Ferment, I've jumbled them up. I'm sure you can see that there are a huge array of animal and natural forms, but they're interplaced with human forms of symbols taken from, I don't know, the computer, through mathematics. And as they jumble together, it strikes me that they don't really have much compatibility. And so inferment, or inferment, is what is happening inside. It's a heady brew. We're on the way to trouble. I think it could well be frothing out the top before we finish this talk. Lacrimal vase. A vase of lament. In the past, the Greeks and perhaps the Romans, at funerals they used to have small containers to catch the tears. That seems a pretty sad state of affairs, doesn't it? So many tears you could fill a container. My feeling was that we'd need an awfully big container to cry the plight of the planet. Taking the toll. It's gloomy old stuff, isn't it? Never mind, there's a bit at the end that might pick us up. Taking the toll. Well, I realised by inverting the vase, one arrives at a bell. The bell seems such a significant image to me. We use bells to celebrate, weddings, whatever. But we also use them to toll the disaster. Now, I don't really want to be pessimistic as a sculptor, but the position we find ourselves in is very difficult not to be. But I would like them to be celebrative as well. Is that a word? No. I would like them to celebrate the biodiversity that exists and make sure that we care about it and it lives on. Toxin. It's a word that I'd never really come across before, but I'm assured that it is in parlance and really means a warning bell. It was told in villages when the village was being attacked, I suspect, or maybe when there was a plague. But toxin is a natural bell. Now you notice my bells are not bell-shaped in the traditional Western sense, simply because I didn't like the forms of the what should we call it, the Christian bell tower, bell. So I looked much further, and I found there were all sorts of bells that could be found, especially in China. And these spaces here were where the bells were hung from a leather strap. We could still hang these bells and they would chime to a degree, but Pangolin founders very cleverly have made the bells so they will chime as they stand. There's a stainless steel structure inside that sits on a stainless steel base, and so the bell isn't mute. It can, if you dare, go down and knock it and it will make a sound. Not a very beautiful sound, I must say, but a sound. This is the third of the bells. And as you see, I've done the same thing. I've mixed up human images, human symbols with the animal symbols. So ringing the changes is what we're seeing. We're seeing ourselves separate from the rest of the world. So, on to the main nub of the exhibition. Quickly then. Evolution is the main subject. The Red Queen, as I told you, was thought up by Van Valen from the Lewis Carroll. And if you remember the the queen was part of a chess game. And these images, I felt in some way, may look slightly as if they were pawns or figures on a chessboard. If you notice, the stance they take is very close to the sculpture that I called Back to Beginning, way back at the start of this talk. So they're bipedal, so slightly human. The queen wears her crown, and she's in charge of all the images. But instead of making the images absolutely identifiable, as you would have seen in the other pieces, the birds, the animals, if you look, they're there in the previous pieces. But now, I'm using evolution as a way of making things. So the pattern starts with one random shape, and the next shape has to fit the last shape, and the shape after that has to fit the next two shapes. So I like to think of these forms as evolving in themselves, both as a sculpture and perhaps as imagery. This one's called Court Jester. Court Jester was, like the Red Queen, a term thought up by a biologist. It was simply that he thought that the Red Queen was able to describe exactly, as Darwin had said, the force of natural selection. Things gradually change and then become a new species. But he said, well, hang on a minute. There's a much rarer phenomenon, earthquakes, volcanoes, being struck by meteors. And these huge, devastating forces knock evolution off their pedestal. So these mass extinctions that happen mean that there's a void and then there's rapid evolution. I thought that was interesting. So I've got two players, and then I thought I'd introduce my own. Becoming the Fool. This is us. This is us because we now are putting the pressure on. In just the same way as the Court Jester, we are expanding in population, stealing habitat, we're changing the climate. We're just as much a threat as the Jester, if not more. So there's the Fool in his full glory, all bells and whistles, trampling all before him. And if you see, the patterns are dissolving and changing in a much more abstract way, I suppose. There you are, you can see the detail. I think what you need to realise is that we're beginning to understand that the web of life is just that. It's a network of everything joined to everything else. You take one element out and the thing starts to collapse. So I feel that these images are making this web net-like structure. And my drawings, well, they're really mirroring and echoing what my sculpture is trying to say. All life is cellular, everything fits together and makes an intricate network. The Red Queen, however, when introduced, you can see what a difference she makes. Things start to change. We call it speciation. That is, one thing's change to become something else. We're back to the Fool. This is called Fools Make a Difference. Fools aren't easy to see, especially when they're ourselves. We lack the perception to see them sometimes, but we can see it quite clearly in this blow-up. This is the Fool's hat. And there's one down there that very much looks like that as a sculpture. However, if we take time to look, it becomes very evident about what we're doing. The fool is there. Rather like wearing polarizing sunglasses, we can see through the surface and see, but maybe not understand what we're doing. Well, not enough to do anything about it anyway. So, this is just a little bit of happiness to end with, okay? The evolution that we've been talking about probably was following the traditional notion that Darwin put forward, that we were starting at the bottom from a single source, like a tree, travelling up and then branching out into ever more branches of the whole tree. So we're all connected but separate. However, we now find that this isn't absolutely true. Branches start to grow together. And so back to making a network. So this drawing really is suggesting not all life isn't a conflict. Symbiosis is much more prevalent than we thought perhaps it was. Symbiosis means equal benefit, so not parasitic, but symbiotic. So I've split the page by a single line, a continuous single line. The black is absolutely equal to the white. And last but not least, perhaps, we're all part of the intimacy of strangers, as this symbiotic element was called by a woman called Lynn Margulis. What she realised, and nobody else would believe her, was the mitochondria that we talked about earlier, which are the battery on each cell of every living thing, were not something that was part of the genome of each individual creature, but was in fact, once in its lifetime, a bacteria. So, what we now know is that we're all full of creatures on the inside and the outside, living in symbiosis with us. So maybe that's a very good reason for us to take care of the natural world. We're part of it and it's part of us. Okay, I think that's all I have to say. If anybody'd like to...
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt. I just have to say that was a very thought-provoking, fascinating, and actually I thought very moving talk. So on behalf of the museum, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Abigail. I don't know if anybody feels that there's anything they'd like to ask, or dare to ask, perhaps. Yeah, please.
I was interested in, you showed a head at the beginning, fairly early on, one of your early heads, and you talked about the indentations. Was that, you were talking about
Yeah.
that? And you said by doing that, you made it appear in its own form.
I felt really, I suppose, by destroying its nature or ability to look naturalistic, it started to become the object rather than a representation of the object. So the head wasn't a representation of a head per se, not a copy of life. It was this thing which was a piece of bronze, and by having a surface on it, it seemed to me that it took it away from reality and perhaps gave it the possibility to be something else, which we might think about, whether it was ritualistic or... The truth is, when we think about it, we've been decorating our bodies ever since we've been human. I'm absolutely sure that the first art was on people's bodies. I mean, it might even be that we lost our hair so that we could make our bodies covered in pattern. After all, we aren't very colourful in comparison with the world of birds, are we? Or insects or fishes. So that might be a reason why we colour ourselves. But it's very interesting to notice how many people now feel, I mean, we're probably the exception here, but how many people colour themselves with tattoos. And I don't know, are they meaningless or are they meaningful? Surely they do identify themselves as individuals, or that's what they would like to do. But that was the only reason. I think it was a start of something. It was a start of trying to get away from naturalism. Somebody once said they were released from the slave that naturalism is. And I kind of know what they mean. You know, if you're trying to make something look like something, and that's all it is it a piece of art? Well, I suppose it is, but I can remember making very real figures when I was a student. I mean, highly excited that sometimes you felt they were almost going to breathe. But then when you stepped away, I thought, well, I don't think these are sculptures. They're copies of life. And going to museums and seeing those figures like Dwayne Hansen, where he moulded real individuals and then painted them and put hair on them and eyelashes and glass eyes. It seems to me that that's one way of trying to look at ourselves, but there's a simpler way, and it's to do with trying to find this fit between what we experience in life, which is how we see the world, because without experience you can't see that, you know, it is a creative act. And if you can make something that somehow fits closely with those kind of templates that you lay down over time, we might call that beauty. We might call it pleasurable. Who knows? But if you think about music, why is music pleasurable? It's not pleasurable if you haven't heard it ever. You know, it takes time to learn what music is, to accept it and delight in it. After all, we don't make birdsong, do we? We make an abstracted noise which we find very beautiful and pleasurable, I think. Possibly. Who knows? Anybody else want to? Yes, please.
Can you say something about the colours you choose? Because you seem to have a huge range of vibrant at one point and now they're much more seemly, or some word like that.
Yeah, good question. I don't know whether I can answer it. I was going to say earlier on, you know, the viewer is such an important part of making an art piece exist, because after all, I may have intentions, but you may read it in a completely different way. So you shouldn't necessarily believe anything I've said. I can only think there were two reasons, really. At the beginning, which we didn't see, I made all my sculptures really colourful, because I thought it was modern. I thought it was a way of being trendy, I suppose. Anyway, I made some work which was for Swindon. It was a public piece of art. I made it in resin, and within the week it had been cut up and smashed, and it was horrific. It was like going to a butcher shop. I vowed then I would use bronze, because bronze is permanent and it's a material that takes on the life of clay in a way that lots of materials don't. And after all, I was a modeller. Problem with the bronze is I thought it sort of seems so much like antiquity. How did I make a figure to be about now? So when I took up the courage, I didn't just patinate them, I started to paint them. Because I realised bronze wasn't just a beautiful material, it wasn't precious. In fact, I was always told that it costs the price of cheese per kilo. I think that's changed now, but anyway. So why shouldn't I paint it? Well, two reasons to paint it, I think. One, it stops being like a natural object, becomes an object in its own right. And two, it grabs your attention. So, you know, that's what you want to do as an artist, don't you? You want to grab the attention of the viewer so that they might start to debate with what you do. But also, having been involved all my life with birds, I was thrilled by colour. You know, why would a sculptor leave it out? It seems strange, but when we look back at the past, of course, all colour has been stripped from ancient Greece, Rome, etc. So I'm ambivalent about it. I like to use it, but it can get in the way as well. And the reason I didn't make the pieces downstairs colourful, because there's an awful lot going on. In fact, I did make them colourful initially. Red Queen, red sculpture. But it just seemed too obvious. You know, I think as a maker and as a viewer, I think you want work to do. I think you want to be able to make your own interpretation. And I think you want to solve the puzzle that the sculptor artist has posed for you. And I always thought by making patterns was I might keep the viewer for just a little bit longer. It's not true, because people don't even notice what I've made on the surface. But never mind, that was the attempt. Okay, thank you. Right, Abigail, I think. Was that a flag up to say anything there, or?
I had one question from the museum front of house staff, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
Lots of families or visitors who aren't going to read the catalogue but have just seen your work and enjoyed it have gone away with a sense of optimism, and they've been uplifted by the colour and pattern and all the animals and natural forms.
Well, I'm very pleased.
Maybe in contrast to some of the themes.
Well, I'm very pleased, but my answer to that really is that, yes, I do want to celebrate life, and I've always felt that, you know, I think it's all too easy to make art that's pessimistic. But on the other hand, you can't stick your head in a sack. Things have got to such a state. I mean, I've got lots of facts and figures which, you know, probably bore you to tears, but, you know, since I was born, the number of species and animals that have disappeared are just colossal. And as somebody that values the natural environment and the biodiversity, I mean, what a thrill it is. And we see it on the television, but it's not there outside of the camera. You know, they go to very special places. They know all the individuals that can find the stuff. I mean, I've been going to Africa with Rungwe and Claude to their foundation for 10 years, is it? 10 years. And the difference in those 10 years is sad. And I know people have got to live somewhere and, you know, they have to feed themselves, but we all collectively need to do something. But I suppose, in a way, the sculpture isn't supposed to be polemic. It isn't supposed to be something that is trying to entice people to put their hands in their pockets and, you know, save the forest or whatever. I just think I need to tell you about the motivation. If you want to interpret it in a wholly different way, I'd be only too delighted, really. Do you think it's time for a glass of wine? Thank you.